First, let me thank IEEJ and APERC for inviting me to this session. It's always good to be in Tokyo in Japan. And I also would like to mark this occasion on the historic relationship between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Japan. The relationship stretches for more than 70 years. It started with the export of oil back in the 1950s. But as we marked this year, actually 7 days ago, last week, in April 20th, Saudi Arabia shipped the first commercial shipment of blue ammonia to Japan. It's a historic partnership that's focused on energy that was there for the 20th century, but I'm very hopeful that it will continue in the 21st century as both country and the globe aim to reach carbon neutrality. So my presentation is going to focus on the discussion around how can we achieve a smooth and orderly energy transition, and what are the policies that are needed to balance out the use of fossil fuel. So let me first maybe introduce KAPSARC. KAPSARC is an energy think tank that's very focused on energy and sustainability, that's based in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. We like to think that given our position in Saudi Arabia, that we are a more balanced think tank, where we offer a different perspective between advanced economy and emerging economies, but also we give the perspective of energy producing nation in addition to that of energy consuming. Over the past few years, and especially during Saudi Arabia's presidency of the Group of 20, G20, we've been very focused on the concept of the circular carbon economy, or CCE. And the concept of the circular carbon economy basically looks at not only reducing our emissions, but also how can we add to that and incorporate the reuse and the recycle and the remove of CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions through nature-based solutions, planting trees and oceans as natural sinks, but also looking at artificial sinks using carbon capture and sequestration, but also direct air capture and other removal methods. What we have been studying over the past few years, and what our modeling has shown, that without the circular carbon economy, or what we call decarbonization, that the cost for the global economy to decarbonize and reach carbon neutrality would be much higher. We're talking about $13 trillion difference between a framework and a pathway that incorporates decarbonization and the continuation of fossil fuel over the next few decades, and one without that would rely only on new energy or clean energy. And so limiting ourselves at the outset to a narrower set of technologies by restricting direct air capture, CCS, and others, including nuclear solutions, carries a significant risk to the global economy and to an orderly and smooth transition. I will not explain the graphs, but basically we've done a lot of modeling at KAPSARC, but also in collaboration with IPCC and other interested and aligned think tanks and universities to look at this. But I would like maybe to speak more about what we are not doing today. If we look at what is the amount that is needed to ensure a smooth and orderly transition globally, the estimate has been ranging between $3 to $8 trillion per year. Today, if we look at globally, we're almost at 50% of that threshold, of the minimum. So if we're looking at 3 trillion, we're basically at 1.5 trillion. However, we're not all moving at the same speed. So if we look at what Paris Climate Agreement called Annex 1, or basically advanced economy, versus non-Annex 1, you can see that the two are moving at the same almost speed. However, the disparities are very different. And so if you remove the two largest economy from the advanced economy, which is the US, and the China from the emerging economy, the pictures look very different. And so if you look at what the current advanced economy are investing, we need to double that to actually have a smooth and orderly transition. If you look at the emerging economy, we need to almost double, a little bit more, so 2.6 times invest. If we remove the US, actually the pictures look better for advanced economy. We need a little bit less than doubling our investment. But if you look at emerging economies, they need to actually increase that amount by 5 times. And so even if we look at globally that the investment in energy transition and sustainable energy is not enough, looking at it just geographically shows that even that is not sufficient. And so if we look at countries in Asia, if we look at countries in the Middle East, if we look at countries in Africa, they need a lot more help in doing that and having a smooth and orderly transition. So the idea that all countries are moving at the same speed and have the same capabilities to achieve a carbon neutrality by 2050 is something that needs a lot of revisiting. And we need to make sure that we avail this path to all countries. In 2021, and in the road to Glasgow, IEA made a lot of fireworks by announcing their new net zero scenario. And I think they have walked back from that a little bit. But the main headline was that there needs to be no new oil and gas investment for us to achieve the net zero scenario. And I think if we look at this, we can see that the IEA were actually very pessimistic. And while that is one scenario where we can keep 1.5 and reach 1.5 warming world by 2050, it's not the only scenario. And so when we looked at the network for greening financial financial process and financial flows, they've actually developed a few other scenarios. And if you look at their scenarios, they look at global oil demand in 2050 compared to global oil demand in 2020. And in the IEA net zero scenario, the amount of oil we will need in 2050 is only 20% of what the world used in 2020. But if you look at the other scenarios that others have developed, we're looking at something between 0.4 to 2.6 in a net zero by 2050. And for a below 2 degree scenarios, we're looking at 0.6 to almost 0.85. So instead of the world oil demand being 92 million barrels in 2020, we're looking at a world that the range of forecast that would look at it in a world that is compatible with the Paris Climate Agreement can range between 20 million to almost 80 million barrels per day. And so when we say there needs to be no new investment in oil and gas, we need to be very careful because that range is huge. And we could be sleepwalking into an investment crisis and a supply crisis that we got a taste of last year during the conflict in Ukraine. And so it's very important that when we look at this, that we think about the range of scenarios that are available. And we don't take one scenario and try to shoot for that. And I think the whole idea that we should limit supply so demand will go down is something that we struggle with. And while my numbers here show oil, the same picture applies for gas. I will move into the discussion around how the Middle East region, and KSA in particular, will play a key role in supplying a bigger fraction of the needed oil. If we look at the CO2 intensity for each barrel of oil or barrel of oil energy equivalent that is being produced today, Saudi Arabia is the lowest as a major producer. It's the second as an overall producer. And the same thing when we look at fugitive methane emissions. So Saudi Arabia, but also, similar things apply to the UAE and Qatar and other countries. So if we look at the energy intensity, the carbon intensity, the methane emission intensity for each barrel that is being produced, Middle East players have an advantage. And that's why we're seeing Saudi Aramco, ADNOC, and other players continuing to invest in their upstream capacity. They believe they have an advantage going forward in a world where carbon budget is under constraint and where carbon neutrality is an objective. However, you cannot supply the full global oil demand to come from Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the Middle East. And if you look at other Middle East producers, Algeria, for example, it actually scores, near the bottom when it comes to carbon intensity and methane intensity. And so we need to make sure that the oil and gas we produce will reach the level that is needed. Not only we keep it, to the best practices, but how can we actually lower it? But also it's very important that we make a distinction. Countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and other Middle East producers have a strategic incentive in investing for the long term. And so they're willing to invest in their oil because they believe they will be producing in 2050. Other countries and other regions don't believe that. And so they might be producing until 2030 or 2035 and 2040, and then they will phase out fossil fuel production. However, they don't have the incentive to invest today to make their oil and gas production cleaner. And so while they might comply with phasing out fossil fuel by 2050, if you look at it from a carbon budget, it's actually not productive for the globe. And so we need to make sure that all countries continue to, lower their energy intensity, carbon intensity, and methane intensity. And that leads me to the next discussion, which is that CCUS is a critical component, not only of the IEA net zero scenario, but even other scenarios. The IPCC says that they doubt that we can achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 without the accelerated development of carbon removal technologies. That includes CCUS and other. And if we look at the future energy needs and the future energy carriers that we're talking about today, like hydrogen and ammonia, blue hydrogen and blue ammonia, CCUS becomes an enabler for that. And the level of CCUS that the IEA net zero scenario, even in a world where only the world consumes 20 million barrels per day, not the 80 or the 60 or 70 million barrels, they expect CCUS that we need about 8 gigatons. Just for comparison, today's emission is around 55 gigatons. So almost 20% of the reduction needs to come from renewable technologies. If we look at a world where oil demand is 50 or 60, 70 million dollars, that needs to scale up. And so we don't have a lot of room. We need to invest today in making sure we're cleaning the supply chain of the production of oil and gas and other fossil fuels today. Not wait until 2040, not wait until 2050, not just look at the phase out of fossil fuel, but we need to clean out those production and making sure those uses continue to be aligned with a carbon neutral world that we can achieve by 2050. With that, I conclude and thank you for your attention.